Hello everybody, it's Kara from Wild Book Garden, and today I'm here with my May wrap-up. The first book I finished in May was Vicious Spirits by Kat Cho. I think this is the UK paperback, so they list it as Dokebi Vicious Spirits, but Vicious Spirits I think is the original title. And this is the companion book or companion sequel to Wicked Fox. So in this book we're following two different main characters, and they are So-min and Junwoo. Actually both of these characters we meet in the first book, and Junwoo is kind of a troublemaker. He's a Dokebi, which is a particular kind of creature. I think the translation of the word is goblin, but he's like a particular kind that's like very attractive and charming. And he's kind of a con man. And So-min is a friend of one of the main characters of the first book, and she really doesn't get along with Junwoo. She doesn't trust him. She thinks he's arrogant and really annoying. But the two of them end up spending a lot more time together in this book. So part of the book is about their relationship, and then another part of the book deals with the two main characters from the first book, some fallout that happens from the first novel, and trying to figure out how they're going to help one of those characters. And then So-min starts seeing ghosts, so that adds to the plot. And Junwoo also, there's a villain kind of like from his past who turns up and starts making things very complicated. And I did like this more than the first book. The first book I was pretty disappointed in, and this one I did like more, mostly because I much preferred So-min and Junwoo as main characters. I found them much more interesting. I found their romance a lot more enjoyable. I just found the main characters and romance from the first book fairly bland. Unfortunately though, the two main characters from the first book still get chapters in this book, which was kind of disappointing. I much preferred following Junwoo and So-min, and my favorite parts of the book were just on them spending time together and getting to know each other and realizing that they have misjudged the other person. I just really enjoyed their dynamic, and I wish there had been more focus on that rather than the two main characters from the first book, who are Mi-young and Ji-hoon. I just didn't think they were super well developed. And I also didn't love the plot stuff in this one. Like, basically I was here for the romance, and I did enjoy that. I also think the book did a good job of addressing the like supernatural age gap between the two characters in this book, so I appreciated that. And I just like had fun with this book. The downsides for this one for me are, besides the things I already mentioned, I found the plot itself fairly frustrating. Like the story, there were some parts where the story just felt like moved along by like characters making stupid choices, or like characters having abrupt changes of heart for no apparent reason, or just like not for no reason, but it happened so fast that it wasn't believable. And then I also had an issue with the portrayal of a character that we know from the first book. Maybe I'm just not remembering something from the first novel, but I feel like they did some not great things. And then I feel like we're supposed to excuse that in this book with the reasoning of like, oh, but they really loved this person deep down. It's like, that's good, but if you don't ever show it, I don't think it really counts. So I found that frustrating as well. So I liked this, I didn't love it, but I am glad I finished out the duology, and I did enjoy this book more than the first one. And I gave Vicious Spirits 3.5 stars. Next, I finished my reread of Sensibility by Jane Austen. This was for the live show that I mentioned previously. I just really love this. We're following Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood as our main characters. They are two sisters, and right at the beginning of the book, because of some financial inheritance things, the two of them and their younger sister and their mother end up basically being forced to leave their home, and they end up going to this small cottage, and it's about them getting to know the people in the neighborhood. It is about the two sisters' romantic relationships, but a huge focus is also on the sister relationship between them, which I really enjoyed. And as with all of Jane Austen's novels, there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of really biting social commentary, which I always appreciate. In this novel, it focuses a lot on finance, like just the financial realities of being a woman in this time period, and also how that interacts with romantic relationships. Every time I reread this book, I am very impressed at how, like, initially, I'm not a big fan of Edward, who is Eleanor's love interest. Like, he's fine. I don't really have strong feelings about him, but then every time I read this book, it's like once we get to a point where there's some conflict in the relationship, that's what makes me kind of like retroactively buy into their romance and find their dynamic super interesting, which I think is impressive. And I also think the focus on like what perspective is it best to see the world through in this one was really interesting. Like Eleanor is a very like practical character, and Marianne is very like romantic, and I feel like the book shows that neither one of those extremes is necessarily the best way to live your life. Like, you kind of need a combination. I love Eleanor. She's just like so clever, and I maintain that she is just as sassy as Elizabeth Bennet, but she's just sneakier about it. She's better at hiding it. And Marianne, I really appreciate her character growth. She can be very frustrating at some parts, but you see that she has a really good heart underneath it all. And it's really interesting to see her grow and change. My one complaint with this book is the ending, and specifically Marianne's ending. I'm just not sold on it. It's not that I don't think it would work out, but I think there are some issues that would make it not work out for a while, if that makes sense. But overall, I do really enjoy this novel, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Next, I finished Aminas Song by Henna Khan. This is the sequel to Amina's Voice, and I loved this. Like, Henna Khan is just in the business of making me cry, just like filling me with all kinds of emotion. I think she's a really incredible writer. And this book, of course, follows on from the events of the first one, and Amina has just gotten back from visiting her family in Pakistan, and when she gets back, her class are asked to do a project on a particular person, and she decides to choose Malala Yousafzai, who is Pakistani, and Amina wants to use this as an opportunity to talk about this country that her family is from and that she has this connection to and that she loves. But when she starts talking about Malala, her classmates really focus on the horrible parts of her story, like on what happened to Malala, and they use it as a reason to see Pakistan as this really like oppressive and backward country, and like they pity people who live there and that kind of thing. And Amina's trying to figure out how she can communicate the complexity of this place that she loves, and like she wants to show all the beauty and the good things that are there too. And then while this is going on, Amina is navigating like new and old friendships, and there's also some like family concerns that come up, and I just love this book so much. I love what it's doing thematically. It really deals with the complexities of loving an imperfect place, which I think basically everybody can relate to that. It really talks about how Amina feels torn between these two homelands. Like she's American, but she has this deep connection to Pakistan, and she's trying to reconcile that as being connected to more than one place is not a bad thing. And I really enjoyed that. I love Amina as a main character. I really love the way that Malala's story was worked into this book. I really enjoyed the friendship and family dynamics. I think those were so complex and so interesting. I especially I was surprised at how much I enjoyed Amina's older brother. I feel like when there's one of those character types, normally their relationship is much more antagonistic, but I really liked him and like how supportive he was. And like all siblings, they don't always get along, but I just really appreciated their relationship here. I also like the focus on how you can help in a community. There's this line I really love that is, "Maybe my heart had to ache while it grew to make room for all the people and places I love." I just think that's really beautiful, and yeah, I adored this. I gave Aminas Song 5 stars. Next, I finished Soul Lanterns by Shah Kuski, and this was translated by Emily Balistrieri. This is a very, very short novel, possibly almost novella length, that is translated from the Japanese, and we are following several different main characters, Nozomi, Shun, and Kozo, and they're 3 kids, and they end up getting an assignment in school, kind of like an art project, because this is set in 1970, I believe, which is 25 years after the United States bombed Hiroshima. And their school is doing an art project that talks about the history of Hiroshima before and after. And so these 3 students get an assignment to like communicate somebody's story in an art piece. So they start interviewing their family and neighbors. And this is just a really difficult book to read at times. It's extremely emotional, and you guys know that I read a lot of hard-hitting or intense middle grade books, but every once in a while there's one where I'm still surprised at how heavy it got, or how unflinching it was, and this book was one of those. I think it is so important though. Like, I really think that every American should read this book, and I think other people would really, like people from other countries, I think would get a lot out of it as well. But I think especially if you live in the US, I think this is a really important book to read. I saw some reviews from people talking about the writing style. It's more like straightforward. It's very like concentrated and spare. I don't know if it necessarily detracted from everybody's experience, but that is something that I saw some reviewers mention as oh, be aware of this kind of thing. And it is a very pared down writing style, but I think that was a deliberate authorial choice, and I think it really worked for this story because it's very raw, and part of this book is about Nozomi and her friends realizing that these things they have just grown up accepting are not normal. Like there's this one scene where she talks about a cemetery specifically for the victims of the bombing and the radiation afterwards, and she talks about how weird it is to go to this cemetery and see the same death date on every single tombstone, or like sometimes within a couple days of each other, and that is just such a powerful image. And I think that having this very spare writing style, I think it really fit the tone of the story, because it does start out as this very straightforward, like, oh, this is just how life is. And then throughout the book, as these kids like interview people and they start to think more about these things that they grew up knowing and they always accepted, but they didn't always know the details. Like, I think that style and that approach to the story really fit together. So I did not mind the writing. And also there's a few sections that are letters in this book, and that has a different writing style, like a different tone. It's much more, I think, descriptive. So I think it is definitely like an authorial choice. This is a story that really combines grief and hope. There's definitely a lot of grief. Like, as always, I will put content warnings in the description box. So again, this can be very, very difficult to read at times, but it's tinged with a feeling of hope and a feeling of healing as much as you can. And I'm realizing I forgot to talk about a huge element of this book and the reason it is called Soul Lanterns, and that is because the book starts on the lantern ceremony that the citizens of Hiroshima release lanterns on the water as a memorial for the lives lost on the day of the bombing. And because of this, Nozomi ends up finding out some more about her family as well, and I really liked that exploration and these like complicated connections between families and between people and these different kinds of love. This was a really beautiful book, and the way that I said it in my Goodreads review is that this is a people-focused story. It's a book that takes huge events and tragedies and tells the small human stories within them, stories which are no less important or beautiful for being small or quiet or ordinary. To quote the novel itself, it's a book that reminds us that this world is made up of little stories. I think this book was just incredible, and I gave Soul Lanterns 5 stars. Next, I finished A Tale of Beauty and Beast by Melanie Sellier, and I actually listened to the audiobook for this one, which was narrated by Esther Wayne, and this is the second book in, I think it's Beyond the Four Kingdoms is the name of the series, and my friend Giselle is the one who recommended this series to me, and she had warned me that this book is not very good, and I'm kind of glad I was prepared for that, because I do think this book was pretty like middle of the road for me. So this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and I can't even say who our main character is because that spoils some things from the first book, but basically because of the outcome of the first book, which is a magical trial, one character is being sent off to marry Prince Dominic, who is the Beast, and yeah, like this was just, again, kind of okay. Giselle had warned me that this book follows the Disney movie very closely in some places, which was sometimes a little annoying, but it didn't bother me too much. I did like, though, that some of the reasons that things happen in this book, because of the plot and setting of the series, I thought were really interesting and really creative. Like, for example, the reason that the main character leaves the castle, despite knowing that there are angry wolves out there. The reason for that actually makes a lot of sense in this book, and I liked that. As far as characters, I found the villain really annoying. I found the love interest to be okay, and I found the main character to be likable. My favorite characters, though, were Tara and Lottie, who are two of the servants of the castle. I just really, really enjoyed them. All of their scenes and interactions, they were a real highlight of the book for me. And I also want to mention, I do think the audiobook was really well done. I think Esther Wayne did a really excellent job with the female voices especially. I didn't love the way she did the male voices, though, and specifically the voices of the male, like, main characters or primary characters. The side characters I think were fine, but like the 2 to 3 like main male characters I did not like her voices for, especially the love interest, the Beast character, which might have partly contributed to my lukewarm feelings on him. I just didn't love the way that she did those voices, so that was kind of a bummer. Although I would say, like, overall I think the audiobook is really well done. If that's an option for you, I would recommend it. So yeah, this was fine. It wasn't like an unpleasant reading experience, but I didn't really enjoy it or anything. And I gave A Tale of Beauty and Beast 3 stars, and I do think I'm going to enjoy later books in the series much more. Although I will say that at least the love interest in this book is not as obnoxious as in the first one, so that was nice. But yeah, overall I liked this one less. Next, I finished Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, and this is translated by Jeffrey Trusselot, or Trusselot, and I actually own this book, but I don't have it with me right now, so I will insert a picture. But I really liked this. This is like kind of a series of 4 vignettes. I guess this is sort of like a little bit fabulist or like contemporary with a splash of fantasy, because it's set at this coffee shop where customers can go back in time, but there's all these rules, like they have to sit at this one chair in order to do this. There's a bunch of other rules that you find out, and also they have to go back to the present before their coffee gets cold, hence the name of the book. And these are 4 stories of people who do that. I really enjoyed this, actually. I had heard that you kind of have to push through the first story before things really pick up, and I would definitely agree with that. For whatever reason, the writing in the first story felt extremely clunky. I don't know, it did this weird thing where like character emotions were like over-explained, which I thought was kind of odd. I don't know why. The rest of the writing, I think, like the rest of the stories, I think were really well written, but like the story wasn't bad. And then, like I said, I think the writing just really worked for me a lot better in the rest of the stories. And somehow, despite knowing the premise of this book, it was much more emotional than I expected. But again, that makes sense because most of the people going back in time to talk to somebody, like, you do it because you have regrets. I will definitely say that the story I don't know if I want to say I enjoyed it most, but the one that had the strongest effect on me is definitely the third one. I just thought that one was really, really well done, and it like really hit me. I think overall these stories were really well done. I also liked how each vignette kind of bleeds into the other stories. Like, it's not like a hard and fast like short story collection. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed a lot of the characters in this, because some of them seem kind of stereotypical or flat at the beginning, but as you get to know them better, I really ended up enjoying them. As I said, I was very emotionally invested in this book. The only things that I was kind of disappointed in is I feel like there were a couple places where after we really we have this very believable like portrayal of grief and how messy grief is and how complicated it is, and then it seems like really quickly after that, like we immediately hit like acceptance and like closure kind of thing. And maybe that's just because the stories were pretty short, but that felt a little jarring. So I didn't love that. And then also I had some issues with the very last story in this collection. If you want more details, again, check out content notes in the description box. But there was something where like the character in that story, I think, is supposed to be portrayed like, I think we're meant to think that they did something extremely selfless, and I actually think it was very selfish of them, but overall I did really enjoy this, and I gave Before the Coffee Gets Cold 4 stars. Next, I finished Hearts Unbroken by Cynthia Leitich Smith, and I was reading along with the Indigenous Romance Read-Along, which is hosted by Bethany at Beautifully Bookish Bethany and Michelle from Thor Wants Another Letter. I will link their live show down below. And this is a contemporary novel, and we're following our main character Louise, and she's a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and this book starts with her breaking up with her boyfriend after he says some really like anti-native things, and that's one of the themes of this book, is like the pervasiveness of anti-native racism, and so that really affects Louise's relationships and the relationships that she chooses to pursue, like for obvious reasons. And there's also a big focus on family. Her younger brother Huey ends up getting cast in a school play, but then some angry parents are upset at the fact that a native kid is cast in The Wizard of Oz. So there's a conflict with that, with like this angry group of parents. And then there's also a thematic focus on this idea of separating the art from the artist, and can we even do that, and how do we do that? Then also Louise ends up joining the newspaper, so there's a big focus on that and like her working on the newspaper and doing different stories. And then another big element of this book is a romantic plotline involving her and this Lebanese boy named Joey, and the complicatedness of their relationship. And I was not a huge fan of this book, but I am really excited to read other things by this author. I think the things that I didn't like about this one are like specific to these characters and the way this plot was done. So I am still thinking I'm gonna like her other work, but I didn't really love this one. For one thing, as you maybe can tell from the summary, I feel like there was way too much going on in this book, which does not always bother me in stories, honestly, but I think it did here because some of these issues were really big issues that I feel like got shortchanged. Like for example, there's one point where Louise is pursuing a like sexual bullying story for her newspaper, which is a really important topic, and that's just completely brushed under the rug, and I didn't like that. There's also a conflict involving Louise's best friend where they have this huge fight, and then it's like resolved in like 2 sentences, like within the same conversation basically. So I thought that was really weird. Like, I think that was set up to be a much bigger deal, and then it just kind of fizzled out. I did like a lot of things about this book though. Maybe I should have started there. I actually really liked the writing. I know like going off of Goodreads, a lot of people didn't like the writing style. I actually enjoyed it. I also really appreciated the themes this book dealt with. Like I said, the pervasiveness and the sneakiness of anti-native racism and how it's like so baked into so many elements of American culture. Like there's obviously like the outright, like the very obvious racist actions, but there's also a lot of microaggressions, and I think this book dealt with those very thoughtfully. Again, the art and artist idea I think was really interesting. I also really loved the family elements of this book and how close Louise was with her family. I really, really enjoyed that. And I also really liked the sections of the newspaper that we got. Like we get a few articles throughout the book, and I really liked the writing of those, and I just really enjoyed what they added to the story. So I did like a lot of things about this book, but going back to the issues I had with it, besides having too many plot lines, I also think this book had way too many characters. Although Michelle mentioned in the live show that some of these characters are ones introduced in other books by this author, so maybe it wouldn't feel like that if I had read other books by the author. But just going off of this one, because it's marketed as a standalone, there were just so many characters that were introduced constantly, and you couldn't really tell which ones were going to come up again later and which ones were just like going to be mentioned in one scene, because they all kind of got the same level of detail. And also one of my biggest issues is I could not stand Joey. I hated him. I found him so obnoxious and unlikable, and I feel like the romance element is a fairly significant part of this book. And so that was a problem, that I could not stand that guy. I really didn't like his interactions with Louise. For one thing, I don't understand why they liked each other, except that they're like attractive, like they're attracted to each other. So that was just not super interesting to read about. And I also hated the way that Joey was so condescending in a lot of their conversations. Like, that's most of their interactions is like they're like sniping at each other, or he's like looking down on Louise's efforts. Like, one thing that really irritated me is when Louise is doing her like sexual bullying storyline or like story for the newspaper, she collects quotations from girls on campus who have experienced this, and Joey like reads her article and he's like, this is just she said, she said. He says like, you need more sources. Like this is real journalism. You need to like get more background information. And like, okay, saying you need more like research in a story is a valid criticism, but the way he delivered it made it sound like, why would you ask these girls what they experienced? That's not important. And it's like, the story is literally about girls in their school who have experienced sexual bullying. Why would you not ask them about it? Like, that's literally the whole point of the story. And that really irritated me. Like, just the way that Joey said it, it made it sound like he was being dismissive of the whole idea. Like, not just saying like, oh, Louise, you need to like write this a certain way. So yeah, I really didn't like that. And he just like, a lot of their conversations were about like Joey putting down the work Louise did, or like making fun of like this book does the like cheerleaders aren't real athletes thing, which is like a throwaway line, but Joey says it because he knows that Louise or Lou was a cheerleader. So I don't find that cute. Like, I just honestly don't know what Louise sees in him except that he's good looking, and once in a while they have like an actually good conversation, because the rest of the time Joey is either underdeveloped or outright condescending. And I just didn't find that cute. Like, some of these interactions, it's like maybe we're supposed to think this is like antagonistic flirting, but it didn't read that way to me. It just like really put me off his character. And also, I don't know if this is a reflection on Joey's characterization or the number of characters or both, but I literally forgot his name in the middle of a scene he was in. So yeah, did not enjoy Joey. And I also kind of had mixed feelings about Louise herself. Just, there were big things that Louise wanted, and I don't feel like we knew why. Like, I appreciate knowing what Louise wanted. I think that's an important part of understanding a character, but like her motivations just were not clear, I think, or like her, I don't know, maybe this goes back to like the writing or the characterization, because like, again, I don't think Joey was very well developed, so maybe it's a reflection more on him than like the way Louise was written. But I had some like issues with her character as well. And again, going back to the best friend fight, like Shelby, first of all, she says some like not great things to Louise, which Louise calls her on, and I think that's good. I think that's important. But some of the things that Shelby says about Louise being very self-centered and like always wanting to talk about like her boyfriend drama instead of asking Shelby how she's doing, that was a valid criticism. And like, Louise has one moment of like, oh yes, this is true, I am like this, and then like it's never dealt with again. There was also this kind of weird thing that happened a lot near the beginning of the book, especially, where like every time Louise would meet a new male character, she would like instantly size him up about how attractive he was and like what potential boyfriend material he would be. Which, not that there's anything wrong with like noticing someone's attractive, but the way it was written and like the repetitiveness of it, this was like 3 or 4 different guys like all in a row. It just felt, I don't know, it made Louise feel like her interest in other people was kind of shallow. So I think that was kind of odd, although that did lessen as the book went on. But again, that was her like primary interest in Joey, I think, for a lot of this book. So yeah, I just had mixed feelings about this one. There were some things I really liked about this book and other things that I was not a big fan of. Although again, I think most of those are particular to these characters and the way this storyline was written. So I do think I'm gonna like Cynthia Leitich-Smith's other books a lot more. And then you've Hearts Unbroken, 2.5 stars. Next, I finished a reread of The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. This is a short story that is a very famous one. It's like a feminist horror story, basically, psychological horror. And I reread this because I was a guest on an episode of Literary Gladiators. I think that episode is coming out in the fall. So I really enjoyed discussing this short story, and I really liked it the second time as well. Yeah, it's so well done. So we follow this young woman who, I think today we would say she's suffering from postpartum depression, but they didn't have that diagnosis back then. And her husband, who is also a doctor, decides that the proper way to treat this, which was like widely accepted at the time, is to like basically keep her in a room by herself, almost completely isolated, and not let her do anything, like not let her write, not let her interact with other people, basically just be extremely controlling about her life and what she could do and who she could see, which is nothing and no one, basically. And yeah, and then this main character, she starts becoming really obsessed with this yellow wallpaper, and this is just so well written. The creepiness and the like just pervasive unease of this story is so well done. Like the atmosphere and everything. I think that the way it's written, it feels, what this woman is going through feels very immediate. And that adds like a whole nother layer to how creepy this is. I think it's a really brilliant commentary on how women were treated by the medical profession, and how easy it was to do this. Like that's one of the things too that's really scary, is like how easy it was for husbands or other men in women's lives to like lock them up, and to do these kinds of things to them. And yeah, I actually bumped this up to a 4.5 stars on reread. I just think this is really incredible, and I think it's a classic for a reason. Like the way that the feminist themes are like so intrinsically linked with these ideas of the treatment of mental health, and like, you know, how women basically doing anything that people didn't like was considered like hysteria and grounds for locking them up in an asylum or like on house arrest. So yeah, just a really fantastic story, and I highly recommend it. And the ending is also just very chilling and really, really well done. Next, I finished Thornwood by Leah Sipes. This is the first book in the Sisters Ever After series, and this is a retelling of the story of Sleeping Beauty, but we are following Sleeping Beauty's, or like the Sleeping Beauty character's younger sister. Her name is Bryony, and her big sister is the beautiful Rosalind. And Bryony and her family and her kingdom are kind of trying to prepare as best they can for the inevitable curse to fall on Rosalind, but then something goes wrong. Bryony wakes up from the spell that put everyone in the castle to sleep, and things are not happening the way they're supposed to. And I really don't want to say too much because this book goes a lot of different directions that I think were kind of unexpected, and I really, really enjoyed this. This has a fairly low rating on Goodreads right now, which makes me sad. But I just think it does so many creative and interesting things. I also really liked our main character Bryony, and I enjoyed the sister relationship between her and Rosalind. It's not like, I don't know, it's not like a super happy relationship all the time, but I think it really leans into that feeling of like, when you have siblings, there are times when you simultaneously love them and would take a bullet for them, and also kind of want to throw a shoe at their head. Like, that just happens sometimes, that feeling. And I think this book really kind of plays off of that, which I didn't mind. I think it made sense for the story, and I could understand why Bryony and Rosalind would be at odds a lot of the time, but they really do love each other underneath that, and I really appreciated that. I also really liked the writing and the dialogue of this book. Like, it's so funny and interesting, and I also really loved some of the side characters in this book. I was also just really impressed at how surprising a lot of this book was. Maybe that's part of why people didn't like it as much, because it just does some really unusual things with the Sleeping Beauty story, but I really enjoyed most of them. I also thought the setting was really interesting. Like, it all takes place in this castle that they're all trapped in. The only thing I didn't fully love was the ending. I had kind of mixed feelings about it, because some parts I really loved, and then some parts I didn't enjoy as much, but I think they make sense for the story. And then there were other parts where I'm like, I think we could have done something different. But yeah, I just really enjoyed this. I didn't know what to expect, but I really enjoyed what I got. Like, I think if you want a retelling that does things a little differently, that is like really quick moving and really engaging and has great characters and like some surprising characters and some surprising like plot elements, I would highly recommend this one, and I gave Thornwood 4.5 stars. Next, I finished One Great Lie by Deb Coletti. I actually won this arc from a Goodreads giveaway, and we're following our main character Charlotte, who wins an opportunity to go to this like writing program happening in Venice, like on this island that's near Venice, with her idol, her like favorite author, Luca Bruni. And she gets there. This is like a dream come true, and Charlotte is kind of intimidated by all these other people in the program. She's like kind of tentatively starting to get to know some of them, so this seems like the perfect opportunity for Charlotte, but there's some things that are kind of red flags that are making her uncomfortable, but she's trying to rationalize those. And then while this is happening, Charlotte is also trying to figure out, like trying to unravel this mystery that happened to one of her ancestors, this woman who was a poet named Isabella D'Angelo, and trying to prove that she is actually the one who wrote a famous poem, and just trying to uncover more information about her, because it's always been this story in her family, but there's not a lot of information about her to find. So she's researching that. She meets a boy named Dante, who helps her with her research. And yeah, I overall really enjoyed this. This wasn't a perfect book for me, but I will get to that. I did like a lot of things about it. Like, honestly, one of the strongest elements of this book is just what it does thematically, like these ideas of like the importance of art and what art can personally mean to us. Again, this idea of can we separate the art from the artist, and the way that that is different when it is a currently living and working artist versus like a classic, you know, where the person isn't around anymore. Also ideas of power and whose stories we remember and whose stories are forgotten or deliberately hidden, specifically like women in history and women's contributions. Also the way that we put people on pedestals or like make them into icons. And I also think this book was really heartbreaking in its realism, because part of this book is about abuse of power. Again, check content warnings if you need those. And like when these things start coming to light, the way that plays out is just really upsetting in how realistic it is. Like the red flags and how people rationalize those. The repercussions for the wrong people, like the victim blaming, the way people weaponize their platforms or their followings, just a lot of things that are sadly very current and very topical today. And it definitely things that we have seen a lot lately in like the publishing community, for example, or like authors, or just like arts in general. So I think that thematically this is really, really strong and a really effective book. I also really love the way that Deb Coletti started each of the chapters in this book. I think that that really tied together well, and it was a really, really interesting element. I also really liked some of the side characters like Dante and his mother, who I think her name is Maria. I also loved the way Venice was described. It was this really rich and present setting and element of the book without overtaking the story or anything. It was like the perfect amount. So I liked a lot of things about this. I did have some issues though. One big one is I think Charlotte herself is the least developed character in the entire book, which is disappointing considering she's the protagonist. And I think some of it may have been intentional because Charlotte is a very quiet and reserved character, and she's very uncertain of herself a lot of the time, and I think that was done effectively. There are also some parts of that are just like very relatable about like being socially awkward and that kind of thing, so I get that. But I think even outside of that, I just don't think she had a lot of personality. I don't think there was a lot of development for her. I also don't think this book handled sex in the best way. I think that's a fairly difficult thing to do in YA, and I just don't think it was done super well here. I also am not a reader who enjoys reading people having sex in like weird locations. Like I don't find that enjoyable or like romantic to read about. And then another issue is there were a few places in this book where there was a really kind of surprising, I think, lack of nuance given how thoughtful a lot of other elements of the book were done. I know that these are like very specific examples, but when the rest of the book is so nuanced and thoughtful, the places where it's not, I think really stand out, and they were pretty grating to read, especially if you actually know about the things that the author is talking about and like representing in a certain way or in a misleading way. So I did want to mention that. And I also want to mention that this book is not especially intersectional. There are some brief references to women in the past who were artists and who were queer women. But like overall, this is not a super intersectional book, and some of that might be due to the historical focus. Like for example, it is even harder to find records of women artists who were also women of color, so that might be part of it, but I did just want to mention that. So yeah, overall, I do think this is a really good book. I think it's doing a lot of important things, but I had some issues with it, and I gave One Great Lie 4 stars. Next, I finished Artemis Fowl, the graphic novel by Owen Colfer, adapted by Michael Morecci and illustrated by Stephen Gilpin. So this is like the re-released graphic novels. They have a different adapter, a different illustrator, and if you have read the old ones, the old ones are terrible, and these are so much better. I'm so happy that these are so much better. Yeah, like I really enjoy the art style. Let me see if I can find like an example. Yeah, like just so many great things about it. Like, oh, also, Holly actually has brown skin like she's supposed to. There's no ridiculous, unnecessary shower scene. Like, this graphic novel has so much going for it. And I just really love this. I love this series. I was really excited to get to read this graphic novel for the first time. It was like a really fun combination of like reread and reading for the first time, because obviously I know this story very well. But I had never read this graphic adaptation before, and I really enjoyed that. I also read this very quickly. I never read graphic novels quickly, even though I know a lot of other people do. I guess the secret is if I'm reading an adaptation of something that I like basically know like the whole story, I can like repeat sections from memory almost. Like when the words are so familiar to me, I can read it pretty quickly. And yeah, I have not summarized this at all, but this is an adaptation of the first Artemis Fowl novel, which follows our main character Artemis Fowl II, and he is a like child genius, and he's also a criminal. He figures out that fairies exist, and he decides that he's going to kidnap a fairy and hold them for ransom in order to get gold. And then our other main character is Captain Holly Short, and she is an elf. And in this world, fairies and all those kinds of creatures live underground, and they're very technologically advanced. This is kind of like a sci-fi fantasy kind of series, which I really enjoy. And like I said, Holly is our other main character, and she is the fairy that Artemis kidnaps. But he gets a little more than he bargained for. The rest of the book is about, you know, Artemis's plan and how the fairies are going to fight back, because they decide maybe they're not going to play by their rules either, since Artemis seems to be 3 steps ahead of them the whole time. And I just love this story. I love these characters. I just love watching these plans come together. I think the story of this book is really interesting, and yeah, it's a book I love. It's an adaptation that I think was brilliant, and I gave Artemis Fowl, the graphic novel, 5 stars. Next, I finished Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and I was reading this along with a read-along group, which was, I think, just called Mere Christianity May, hosted by Krista from Books and Jams, and she had a bunch of other co-hosts. I will link the live show or like her channel or her playlist down below, and I'm really glad I finally read this. This is a like classic of nonfiction, of specifically theological nonfiction, and yeah, like there's some things I loved and some things I was not as pleased with this book, but again, I am very glad I read it. It's also very interesting because these were originally talks given over the radio during World War II, and I think knowing that gives a really interesting and important historical context for these. I also think it's interesting because when the talks were originally given, they were intended to explain Christianity to people who didn't necessarily know, whereas nowadays I feel like most people assume, like including myself, would have assumed that you would only pick this up if you were Christian or like if you were very knowledgeable about Christianity. So I just think that's interesting. And I'm going to apologize right now because I think I'm just going to have to go to my very, very long Goodreads review that I wrote as I was trying to sort out my feelings and just kind of go down the list. So I'm sorry this isn't going to be particularly dynamic in this wrap up. So I also think it was really great to read this with a group and to like discuss it. And I was also pleasantly surprised at how forward-thinking C.S. Lewis was in some places. Not all places, but there were some moments I was pleasantly surprised. And there were some places where it was kind of a mixed experience. Like, for example, sometimes he has really progressive ideas about women and sometimes not so much. I will list specific like content warnings in the description box as always. And I will say that like most of them were at least very short. Still not great that they were there, but I guess it was nice that they weren't more extensive. And then I also want to mention something that's going to sound very silly, but this book is like very, very like Christian centric in a particular way. And I think I must be used to reading more like modern books on religion and theology, where study and respect for other religions is more of a focus and an expectation. So that also, like, I didn't love that about this book. And relatedly, if somebody were to pick up this book now and like primarily they were going to form their ideas of what Christianity is or what Christians believe from this book, I would want to provide some footnotes. All of that said though, there were some truly beautiful or profound parts, and I do want to highlight a few of those as well. Like there's the idea he talks about that like patriotism is not automatically a good thing, which was even more shocking at the time that these talks were given. Like this was on the radio during World War II, and I think it was actually during the Blitz. So that was pretty radical of C.S. Lewis to say. I also really loved the section on forgiveness. I feel like there's a perception that the Christian notion of forgiveness is very like wishy-washy. Like, oh, it's fine, God forgives sins, so no need for accountability. And this book really pushes back against that idea. And it makes the point that forgiving somebody does not mean that what they did wasn't wrong. It does not mean that you have to be okay that they hurt you. Like forgiving somebody means giving yourself permission to heal from the wounds they gave you instead of letting them fester, and it also means wanting somebody's best for them. It does not mean that you should overlook the bad things that they did. Also, he makes the point that loving your neighbor does not mean you have to like them. It's great if you do, but it's not a requirement, which I thought was interesting and kind of funny. I also love the idea that love without action is not love at all. I firmly believe that, and I think he did a really great job of showing that here. Also on the topic of love, he mentions that he talks about how love is a choice. It's not just a thing that like happens to you. And specifically he's talking about like romantic love and how you won't always have that like falling in love feeling, and how that's okay and that's not a bad thing, and it can lead you to other kind of different kinds of love that are also really important, that are no less important or like fulfilling. So I really like that. And I think that was so interesting because I tend to think of that idea as something being very modern, but C.S. Lewis was talking about it back then. So I think that's really cool. So yeah, like altogether, this is a fairly mixed bag, as you can see. There were a lot of things I really loved and some things I really didn't. I ended up giving Mere Christianity 3.75 stars, and I could see myself returning to it. I actually like need to go through and tab things at some point, but not like a perfect book by any means, but still one that I think has some really important ideas and some very like ahead of its time ideas in some places. Next, I finished The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is a giant bind-up of the complete works of Oscar Wilde, which I love this edition and this cover, but it's very heavy, so I'm probably gonna put it down now. And this was our Past the Classics pick for May. I will link our live show down below. Julia was the host for that, and really enjoyed discussing it with Julia and Taylor. I did not love the story, however. This was a reread for me, and the first time I read it a few years ago, I gave it 3.5 stars, and this time I gave it 2.5. I was not a big fan. So we follow our main character, Dorian Gray, and one day he's like really horrified by the prospect of not being young and beautiful forever, so he ends up, like, it's not really explained how this happens, but his portrait of him, like, as he is, you know, young and beautiful, there ends up being a situation where now the portrait is going to get old and reflect Dorian's aging and also all of the, like, bad things that he does. So the portrait is going to get old and ugly instead of Dorian. He's going to stay young and beautiful. I didn't like the writing, which was a disappointment because I tend to really love Oscar Wilde's writing. I do think some of the dialogue was good in this book, but the actual like storytelling and like narration is just so overwritten and so overdone, and even the entertaining dialogue, there were a few places where it was just too much. I did like the ideas of this book, like the way that we associate goodness with beauty. I think that's really interesting, and I think there's also some really important and interesting elements in this book about like social classes. And one of the things I find most interesting about this book is that the majority of the characters have this one particular idea that they are strongly espousing for the entire story, which is that, you know, beauty is the only good, the pursuit of pleasure is all that matters, there is no morality in art, there's just beauty, that kind of thing. But the way the story actually plays out is kind of saying the complete opposite, which I found very interesting. As far as characters go, I just had a really hard time with them. I did really love Basil. Like, there were a couple characters I enjoyed, but it's one of those stories where like the characters you like aren't in the story very much, or like have terrible things happen to them. So it's like you're either following the only people that you like just being miserable, or you're following absolutely despicable people where it's like, why should I care what happens to you? At least that was my experience. Like, I really didn't like Dorian and I really didn't like Henry, and they were like, they took up a lot of the book. Like, Dorian was likable at the beginning, but just pretty terrible for the rest of the story, which I know is like the point, or one of the points of the story, but it's not a super enjoyable reading experience. I personally just don't like villain origin stories, and that's a little bit what this kind of feels like, so it might just be like my taste as a reader, but I just was not engaged in the story itself. I will say the ending is very strong, but like most of the rest of the plot, I just did not care for much of it. So anyway, even when I read the story the first time, I thought it was my least favorite thing I've read from Oscar Wilde so far. I still maintain that opinion, and sadly I liked it even less this time around, and like I've mentioned, I gave The Picture of Dorian Gray 2.5 stars. Next, I finished The Language of Fire, Joan of Arc Reimagined by Stephanie Hemphill. This is a novel in verse, obviously following Saint Joan of Arc. We start with her early life and then go up through her military experiences, like obviously her leading the armies of France in order to free France from the English crown. And we also go up through her trial and the aftermath of that. And I'm so disappointed in this book. So this is the one, I think I started reading this in like December, and it was just so mediocre that I never wanted to pick it up, and it made me sad because I really love Saint Joan and I enjoy reading about her. I'm gonna say right at the beginning that if this concept interests you, I think Voices by, I think David Eliot is the author, I think it did it much, much better. It's a very different like perspective because it's a collection of poems told from other people, or even like objects around Joan. But I think it gives you a much clearer picture of Joan and a much more interesting story than this book did. And yeah, I don't even know where to begin. So I'll start there. Like, were a couple things I liked about this. I think that the last third or so of the book was much better written and was much more emotionally engaging, although that may partly be because of where we were at in the story. Like, you're naturally going to be, I think, more emotionally invested in it, but yeah, there were some good parts there. I also feel like that was the section where Joan actually felt like she was characterized, and yeah, there were some good lines or moments scattered throughout here and there, but overall I just really didn't care for this. I really didn't like the writing. Like, it's just very generic writing that is spread out into stanzas, basically. And I enjoy novels in verse, but I don't think this is a good example of one. And one of my biggest issues, probably my biggest issue, is the way that Joan herself was written. Like, the way that this author turned Saint Joan of Arc into the most bland, basic, dull, like, strong female character, TM, is just, like, very upsetting to me. Like, oh my gosh, it was just so, like, her portrayal was just so generic in a way that I found personally kind of insulting. I don't know how you write about Saint Joan and make her this boring. Like, honestly, I don't get it. And like that coupled with the writing was just like not great. It was like the author sat down and was like, what is a generic thing that a woman in history would want? And it's like, freedom. And she's like, okay, cool. What does Joan have? A sword. Where is Joan right now? She's in an army encampment. I've got it. And then, like, the line she would come out with is something like, I look around at all of these men. I look at my reflection in my sword and wonder, will I someday be free like them? And, like, it was just so like surface level, so poorly written. And, like, some of these ideas are things that, like, I think could have worked. Like, I'm not saying that Joan would not have wanted freedom. Like, it just the way it was written and the way that her really bland characterization was combined with the really bland writing, it just made it feel like very boring or very cheesy or both, and I just hated it. And then I also want to mention something about the author's note, which, like, this is one of those things that I think probably would not bother most readers, but I want to mention it because it really, really rubbed me the wrong way. So in the author's note, Stephanie Hemphill talks about how she, like, conflated the voices that Joan hears. So St. Joan of Arc, she heard the voices of, I think, St. Margaret, St. Catherine, and I think St. Michael. Those were consistently the voices that she heard throughout her life. These voices of the saints telling her what she had to do in order to, like, take up her sword, you know, get people to give her troops and, like, lead her armies into battle in order to free France from England. And so Stephanie Hemphill talks about in her author's note about how she combined those three voices, and so she made it in her story how, like, Joan just heard the voice of God the whole time instead of these saints, which, like, I think is kind of a weird choice, kind of odd, but okay, whatever. But then she explains why, and this is a direct quote from her author's note. I chose to simplify three voices into one, not only for ease of reading and comprehension, but more importantly because although in the 15th century, hearing the voices of saints was not hard for people to imagine, modern readers do not in large part pray to saints. Like, excuse me, I just find that's so weird. Like, Roman Catholics, for example, do still very much ask the saints for intercession, and I believe Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox Christians do as well. I just find, like, this argument makes no sense to me. Like, if she wanted to do it for reasons of simplification, like, that's fine. I still think it's a weird detail to change in this story that is based on a real person, but whatever. But, like, to say that it's because, like, people won't get it, I just think is very odd. And I also, like, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that, like, the denominations I mentioned specifically are, like, the most important or should be, like, the determining factor in what she chose to do. Like, I'm not saying that. Like, I just wish she would have said what she meant. Like, it sounds like she wanted the story to be more, like, approachable to people, which, okay, if that's, like, why you wanted to do it, say that, but don't act like it's because, like, saints are a 15th century thing that, like, nobody understands or does anymore. Like, I just think that is so bizarre. So again, that whole author's note issue is, like, a very personal thing for why I didn't like it, and I don't think, like, a lot of readers would be bothered by that necessarily, but it did bother me. And that on top of all of the other things about this book that I didn't like, yeah, like, I originally gave this book 3 stars. It was a very grudging 3 stars, but I did give it 3 because it just felt kind of, like, mediocre to me for a lot of it. But, like, some other things about it did make me really angry. Like, its very mediocrity made me angry, and, like, some of the story and characterization things I mentioned, and also just, like, personally the author's note, like I was talking about, really bothered me, and I really, really didn't like. But I'm having trouble deciding how much that should factor into my rating, like, that particular thing, because, like, I know that we can't be purely objective about books, but that is an extremely subjective thing, and I just don't know how to, like, handle that in terms of my rating. But regardless of whether I keep it at 3 stars or lower it to, like, 2.5 or something, I think it's pretty clear that I did not enjoy this book. This was such a huge disappointment. Next, I decided to pick up the next book in this graphic novel series. This is the most recent one to come out, and that is The Arctic Incident, the graphic novel, also by Owen Colfer, also adapted by Michael Morecci, and illustrated by Stephen Gilpin. I unsurprisingly also loved this one. The Arctic Incident is one of my favorite books in the Artemis Fowl series, like the series of novels, and we follow kind of like a grudging team up between Artemis and Holly and some of the other fairies, because Artemis is actually trying to mount a rescue mission, and this is really the book where we start seeing some character development for him, and for Holly as well, I think. And I just really love this story. I find the plot itself very compelling. I love that we're starting to see this character growth. I love the character dynamics here. I really love particular scenes in this one. Like I've mentioned this before, but like that scene when they're boarding the train and like everything around that, it's just like so fantastically written, and I think it was very compellingly rendered here. I really do highly recommend this graphic novel series. I think that whether or not you've read the very bad graphic novels, I think these are great. I also think that you can really follow the story even if you have not read the original novels yet. I think this might be like a good entry point into the series. Or if you're like me and you do already read and love those books, I think these would be great also. Like obviously there are some things that aren't going to get as much detail because, you know, you're adapting a novel into a much shorter format, but overall I think you would be able to follow the story easily, even if you don't have that prior knowledge. One thing I do want to mention is in my copy there were a couple of pages that were like switched or doubled, but I was able to get an ebook version and read that to kind of see what I missed in those parts. So just be aware of that in case you get one of those like misprinted copies, but overall I did really love this, and I gave the Arctic Incident graphic novel 5 stars. Okay, and then finally the last book I finished in May was The Work of Art by Mimi Matthews. It's not like fully a proper romance, but it's not like there's not like a ton of sex scenes or anything, and they're like pretty closed door if I recall correctly. And this was this author's recommendation from Tia at Tia and All the Books, and I did really enjoy this. So we're following our main characters Philly and Arthur, and Arthur is a captain and he was in the, I think, Peninsular War. Yeah, one of his legs was injured, and so there's a lot of discussion of like ableism and the way people treat him and judge him because of that. And then our female main character is Philida, I think, Philida, I'm not quite sure how to say it, but her abbreviated name is Philly that she goes by. And she has recently lost her grandfather, who was her guardian, and so she ends up going to stay in town in London with her, I think, uncle and a couple of her cousins. And while she is there, she catches the attention of this man known as the Collector. He's the Duke of Moreland, and as you can possibly see from the cover, Philly has different colored eyes. She has heterochromia, and she's very beautiful, and this also makes her face very like interesting to the Duke because he likes to collect like one-of-a-kind art pieces, which also extends to like Philly as a person, so he like wants to pursue her and marry her. But there are these really sinister stories about the Duke and like what happened to like his previous wife, and like the lengths that he'll go to obtain something that he wants. And Philly and Arthur end up meeting and getting to know each other better, and Arthur ends up getting involved in trying to help Philly stay out of this Duke's clutches as well. And yeah, like I said, I did enjoy this. This was a very interesting reading experience because some of the book did not go the way I expected necessarily. I did enjoy our main characters. I did enjoy their romance. I think it was like a little, not like a quick romance, but like the intensity, I think, or like the level of devotion felt a little quick in some cases. Like I also really liked Philly, but like the way that Arthur was already thinking about her, like partway through the book, I was like a little surprising, but like I did still like their romance. They had some really great scenes together. I actually like enjoyed the first part of their relationship more. I wish that part of the book had been longer because I just really enjoyed their interactions in that section. I also forgot to mention, but I really loved Philly's dogs and like the inclusion of animals in here. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the writing style. I did have some things I didn't like as much. Like there's just like a couple of like writing quirks that I didn't love. Like the number of times that Philly's, like certain aspects of Philly's appearance or behavior is described as being like so perfectly feminine or like so quintessentially feminine. Like I thought that was like a little odd, but that's like a very minor thing. The thing that I didn't like so much is like the last quarter of this book or so, and also like the ending. I don't know, it's hard because the ending itself is something that I have enjoyed or I have like thought was well done in other stories. I think I just didn't love the way it fit into this story. Like there were certain things about it that actually kind of disappointed me, and I think made for not a less interesting story, but like a less, I don't know, I think there were aspects of the book that didn't feel as strong to me with the way that ending played out, even though I think I get what the author was going for. And yeah, like just like the last like section of the book in general, I did not enjoy quite as much. I think partly because of some character things and partly like some plot decisions, and again like the ending that I mentioned, but I did like this overall. I also really enjoyed some of the side characters, like Mrs. Ogilvy, I think is her name. I really liked her. So yeah, like I did like this overall. I gave the work of art 3.75 stars, and I am excited to read more from Mimi Matthews. Okay everybody, so those are all of the books that I read in May. I really hope I can edit this down, but we'll see. Please comment down below and let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick them up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!